Chapter 16. The Shark. The kerosene tin bucket and billy cans were empty. A glance at the sky, at the gathering clouds, low down, a sniff of the moisture-laden air, hinted that it might rain soon. But a man must be sure of water. I trudged along the reef at low tide, then into the mangroves at the foot of the peak, walking quite soundlessly, barefooted over the roots and mud, staring among the mangroves, ahead and to the right and left. How quickly a civilized man becomes instinctively primitive. Put him in the environment, and sleeping instincts naturally awake. It was no hint of danger that urged me put the cans down, when within 100 yards of the well, and creeping stealthily forward. And no conscious thought warned that the birds were silent when, on this hot day, they should have been bathing and chirping around the well. I peered from between the twisted forks of a tree. There was the ring of stones that formed the lip of the well. The dry shells and coral strewn there must be quite warm, but no birds were splashing in the cool water. Their uneasy flutterings and chirping complaints were coming from somewhere deep among the trees surrounding the well. So Charlie was on the rampage again. So was I, with a quick, mad feeling. Cautiously I worked back among the mangroves, then bending while jumping from root to root, quickly reached the reef and ran round the seaward side of the peak, and so to the lagoon and Charlie's camp. The fire was banked as usual, the tent door neatly closed. Seizing a fire stick, I whirled it around until it blazed, then broke into the tent, throwing the fire stick at the walls, then throwing Charlie's few things to safety outside. As the tent blazed up, I ran up the tiny divide, then crawled amongst the grass and peered over the top. Charlie was already racing up the path from the well, waving his toy gun at the smoke and yelling like mad. He panted straight past and plunged at the burning tent. Running down the path to the well, I quickly filled the buckets, had a long drink, grasped the buckets, and hurried away for the reef and the mound. Charlie was forcing me to live like an animal among the rocks. Now he would have to find a den for himself or else build a gunyah. But when I'd reached the mound and hidden the water, the warmth of triumph wore off. The position was serious. If every time Charlie went crazy he was to lie in ambush at the well, then one of us must go under sometime. It might be a long time yet. He only went really mad at the height of his bad spells. During such periods I might have water stored at the mound, but sooner or later, if we were marooned here long enough, we must clash at the well. It was almost impossible to watch him continuously and at the same time keep the water cans filled. But both the mangrove forest and the tiny ridge hid each camp from the other. When the tide was in, it completely separated us. When it was out by day, each of us had to fish to live. In the mangroves, we might be prowling a mile apart or only a few yards, each unseen by the other. If low tide, I trespassed on Charlie's country by climbing the peak, and from that vantage point failed to see him. It would be impossible to tell whether he was in the mangroves fishing, or hiding by the well, or lying asleep, or brooding in his camp. The hardest part of it all was the utter absurdity of it. Two lonely men on a barren island fighting one another. Gloomy thoughts these as I picked up the fish spear and entered the mangrove forest. Savage thoughts too. Right into the black heart of the great sea swamp, over patches of coral sand and acres of thick black mud, matted with a network of roots, never slipping on the bowl-shaped roots, never treading on a rotten one or those deceptive ones that will not bear weight, stepping surely onward now and again, ducking head or shoulders naturally and unconsciously under fantastic branches that drooped lower than their fellows. Whether in desert or jungle, man will soon grow into the life he must live to keep alive. In places here were tree-sheltered inlets holding long quiet pools. Some were crossable by bridges of slime-encrusted tree trunks washed by mighty storms from the distant mainland. The laws and vagaries of the coming and going tides had brought them across the sea, then floated them over the reef and swept them along these twisting water lanes among the trees. Perhaps the seas in ages past have populated whole island systems that way, swept canoe loads of people many miles out of their course to cast them upon some uninhabited island, just as the sea with its flotsam and jetsam has made thousands of islands, as even today it is washing the seeds of plants and trees to thousands of island shores. Walking in this gloomy silence, a man stepped silent as a shadow, with eyes ceaselessly peering to right and left, down at the mud and into every pool of water. Bare feet on moist tree roots make no sound, leave no track. Often a hideous head would wave from below the mangrove roots as the needle-toothed snout of a sea eel poked out from its burrow. Nearly always the heads of these sea eels swayed to and fro, their eyes like shiny beads. Sometimes the bones of fish would lie before their burrows. Always hideous were these heads, swaying as if gasping open-mouthed like many-fanged serpents. It was surprising how far one could see between the myriad trunks merely by the tiniest movement of the head. A stranger in this labyrinth would flounder desperately in the mud and become entangled in the roots, his vision limited to yards, an eerie world, the smell of mud and water and vegetation over everything, the sharp pistol-like reports of a bursting mangrove pod, and an unexplainable sound far away. Then a slow sucking movement here and there in the mud. Watch it for minutes, and a mud bubble slowly rises, tremulous as it grows. It gradually subsides, or else rises until it bursts with a plop, ejecting gas from the miniature crater. No doubt these eruptions are caused by decaying fish or vegetable matter. Sometimes came the ghostly whispering of thousands of tiny crabs as they moved like a living, rustling carpet all around the strange intruder. That carpet emitted the softest hissing, hundreds and hundreds of them, merging into one sound, and as it moved, thousands of tiny eyes glared up, thousands of tiny claws were raised menacingly. The moving mass constantly opened at the center as I stepped forward, and as constantly closed in as I passed. It moved with me effortlessly as a mass, yet each tiny crab moved individually. To step smartly forward meant that a lane would open sharply with clinkings of tightly packed shells as the crabs scurried aside from feet that would tramp them down. Sometimes at night on the mound I used to shudder at the thought of a man becoming crippled in the mangroves and one of these carpets finding him. I halted a moment at a favorite channel, gazing at the shallow water. A fish darted past, another followed, speeding swiftly in among a clump of roots. Others, like ghostly shades, sped by. This activity was strange, for the water had not been disturbed. A big spotted bream was lying uneasily between two roots, head turned upstream. With a sudden swirl of the tail, it was gone downstream. A fleeting streak. Now a fine cod came swimming swiftly down the channel, his big blunt head rippling the water. Instantly I threw, then leapt into the water, snatching at the spear haft as the impaled fish struggled to tear it away. A sudden swishing noise, and I jumped for the mangrove roots, the water hissing as I sprang for the branches and glanced behind. Instinctive terror had caused that wild spring. The fin of a shark cut the pool as the monster snapped right and left at fish that darted from every quarter of the hull. My thigh was stinging, and the worn pants were torn away. What looked a nasty gash accounted for the stinging. It was a frightening moment. A man can be deadly scared when he is hurt and quite alone. Visions of a poisoned wound from the mangrove mud brought a sickly feeling. Really, the shark's teeth had merely grazed the leg, but it looked bad enough at the time and in the circumstances. Tearing off the shirt, I made a hasty bandage, tightened it with a mangrove stick until the rotten cloth tore. The wound began to throb in pain, then began to bleed profusely. I hurried back towards the mound, fearing the loss of blood might cause faintness, and that the tide swirling in would trap me amongst the mangroves. The mound had never seemed so far away, but I limped out of the mangroves at last and thankfully breathed in the open air and gazed on the sky and the sea. After a rest, thirst came. As I hobbled forward again, the leg was stiff and throbbing. Badly scared, I crawled up over the boulders to where the cool water lay hidden. The heat from those granite boulders made a man feel faint. It was a job to lever away the flat stone that covered the water. The bucket and billy cans were filled with sand. Charlie laughed from away below, his shaggy head peering over a rock. He leapt up and ran along the reef, hurrying to beat the tide, just beginning to turn. Again and again came his laughter. I was too startled, too dazed to shout. If he had known of my plight, he would surely have returned. This was his revenge for the burning of his tent. There would be no chance of getting water now until morning when the tide was out. I crawled away under the nearest stunted tree of the mangrove side of the mound, raving at what a stupid fool Charlie was. His revenge would perhaps have been sensible enough if a man hadn't been hurt. Very slowly the sun went down behind the hazy mainland, lighting up the peaks of the distant ranges with a dim splendor. A whispering wind sprang suddenly from the southeast. The calm sea, black-green and quick answer, broke into curly tops of creamy foam. The short twilight came, stars peeped out, little coquet blinked sympathetically. That cool wind was heaven sent. Now a veil of blackest velvet crept over the stars. A murmuring began to grow far away in the mangrove tops. It gathered strength, then came moving on, fast growing louder. Soon the wind began to howl in fitful gusts among the rocks. It was late in the night when the first raindrops fell with soft, clinging splashes. When they came ice cold, I crawled down to the billy cans, emptied them of sand, and smiled up at the sky. Wind whistled far back among the mangroves, gradually swelling into a shriek as the vast canopy of foliage shuddered to the blast fury. The surf on the reef grew into a booming roar. Sheets of blinding rain lashed in from the massed darkness above the sea. Shivering, I crept to the big flat rock. The crevice was already filling with rainwater. That was a wonderful drink. Before dawn, bucket and billies and crevice were full.